BTV World. I am Syed Shabahat Ali, and you are watching Fault Lines. The escalations between Russia and Ukraine have a very heavy cost for all the parties to this conflict. For Russia, it is facing one of the worst economic crises of its known history. Not only companies like MasterCard and Visa have suspended their services, but all major oil giants have also disinvested from Russia. Companies like SWIFT have taken Russia off its system, and that means Russia is unable to connect to 11,000 banks in the world. The economic cost is rising further high, but for Europe that imports most of its energy from Russia, the consequences are even more severe. The economic powerhouse Germany doesn't have any alternate fuel available to fuel its industry. And that's sad. Ukraine, a country that was seeking support from NATO for its military defense, has not been able to seek any hardware support from NATO. And this has changed the equations a lot. Our team has prepared a package. Watch the package before I bring my first guest to the program.
In a world of global economic networks and interdependence, countries are intimately connected via supply chains and finances, rendering economic warfare a modern reality. Since the international economy itself has turned into a battlefield, the unprecedented sanctions on world's 11th largest economy, Russia, against the backdrop of Ukraine crisis, has unleashed a swift and staggering economic conflict. The US and allies have hit Russia with unprecedented sanctions, such as expelled Russia's largest banks from the global payments network known as SWIFT, froze hundreds of billions of euros held in reserve by Russia's central bank, export restrictions, barring companies across the world from sending advanced technology. Without reserve funds to shore up the ruble, there is very little the Kremlin can do to prevent its value from collapsing. Moody's Analytics estimates the sanctions-induced slowdown will cut economic output by between 13.5% and 24%, depending on the duration of the conflict and the scale of the decline in Russian energy exports. Russian President Vladimir Putin acknowledged that the sanctions had damaged the country's economy, urging need of deep structural changes in these new realities. According to the Yale School of Management, 380 international companies have announced their withdrawal from Russia since the invasion of Ukraine. In the post-Cold War age of global networks, weaponization of a global financial system is a new reality of contemporary world order, which might induce a fragmented world economy.
My first guest in the program is from Washington, D.C., Eugene Chavsavsky, non-resident fellow of Newsline Institute based in D.C., as I said earlier. Eugene, I welcome you to my program.
It's a pleasure to be here.
And with him, I have Mr. Samad Zia. He's Research Fellow, Contemporary Affair Wing, Military Institute, Army Institute of Military History from Islamabad. He's my guest in studio. I welcome you, Samad, to my program.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Eugene, starting from you, there was a 15-point deal between Ukraine and Russia that has been discussed. It was reported in Financial Times on 16th of March. Do you have any further details about the negotiations between the two sides?
There is no clarity in terms of confirmed details of the agreement because the Russian and Ukrainian side are still negotiating. But there's been some specific reports or some rumors of what this could entail, including from the Ukrainian side, this would entail a complete ceasefire of hostilities by the Russian military and the withdrawal of Russian military forces. Where exactly they would withdraw to, that still remains to be seen, whether it would be to the positions that they held before the launch of the conflict in February 24th, or whether it would go back even further in terms of Russia's position in Crimea and in Donbass in eastern Ukraine, although the latter option is probably not likely. From Russian side, I think it's clear that Russia is seeking Ukraine's neutrality. So what that means is the renouncement of ambitions to join NATO, and also that Ukraine would not host any foreign military bases. But Russia has indicated that it could allow some form of protection to be retained for Ukraine from allies like the US and UK. But there's a lot of things that are unclear moving forward about uh, this potential agreement as well, including what would that nature of this protection from allies like US and UK entail for Ukraine, and the status of territories like Crimea and Donbass, which I mentioned earlier. So we should also keep in mind, as these negotiations are going on, that this could be a genuine effort by Russia and Ukraine to reach a peace agreement, or this could also be Moscow trying to bide time and to regroup its forces in order to continue and to even expand the military operations. So it's still unclear. We're only 3 weeks into this conflict, although we've seen some indications about a potential agreement. It's not clear whether that really is imminent. And I think it's important to point out that both sides, both Russia and Ukraine, basically need to be able to sell any agreement to their respective domestic audience. So whether that's Putin to the Russian audience or especially Zelensky to the Ukrainian audience, there are certain red lines or certain constraints that they can't basically deal. So there's a lot of difficulties here, but potentially there is room for some movement on an agreement.
Eugene, let me take input from my guest in the studio. Samad, you just heard what Eugene said. Broadly, he believes that we don't know how genuine these efforts are from the two sides. He also suspects both the sides are perhaps buying time or playing for their domestic audience.
Right.
Another point that he made is that Ukraine doesn't have much to negotiate once Russian forces are inside Ukraine and spread all over the country. What are your thoughts on it?
Right. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. My take over this is obviously the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Naturally, this has had an impact on Ukraine more than it has on Russia in terms of the sovereignty of the country. With that in mind, Zelensky is in a bit of a pickle right now. He has to work towards some sort of an agreement so as to oust the Russian forces from its territory. Naturally, it doesn't have much room to play around, obviously, since NATO has refused to declare Ukraine as a no-fly zone. With that in mind, it has to be appreciated that Zelensky has to sell some sort of narrative. And the 15-point agenda that Eugene has just talked about, obviously the actual, the text of the agreement has not been shared with the public as of yet, but there are general, there's an idea that obviously Ukraine will have to play some sort of a neutral role in Europe. That's what Russia wants from it. There are a few other things as well, which include the protection of the Russian people in Ukraine. Obviously, its complete exclusion from NATO, which, by the way, is a part of the Ukrainian constitution. By its constitution, it has to join the NATO forces. However, Zelensky might have to somehow discount himself from that as well. So these are some of the things that we have to bear in mind.
Let me go back to Eugene once again. Eugene Samad believes that by not declaring a no-fly zone, NATO has almost lost its capital, its diplomatic capital, or the fear that the rest of the world was supposed to have, or perhaps the promise that Ukraine was banking on. Doesn't look very likely that Ukraine would seek support from NATO in future. What's your take on it?
That Ukraine is considering dropping its NATO ambitions, but the reality is that accession prospect was never very likely for Ukraine into NATO, and I think this conflict has only solidified that reality. So this is why we've seen signals from Zelensky and other Ukrainian officials that some form of neutrality, although it's debatable what form that would take, is something that Ukraine is considering. Probably not a complete demilitarization as Putin has called for, but dropping the NATO ambitions as long as there's still some security guarantees, that is quite possible moving forward. As far as Russia, I think that Russia was prepared to a certain extent for the Western response. Putin even made comments about sanctions, and basically that Russia has lived with Western sanctions for the last 8 years, going back to 2014, and that it was prepared for even more sanctions to be put into place. But I also think that Moscow did not consider that it would be able to conduct military operations, or that it would consider that it would conduct military operations more quickly and easily than it's currently experiencing in Ukraine. So seeing some resistance on the Ukrainian side, perhaps more than they expected. And that's why I think we're in the negotiation phase that we're in.
Don't you think that the cost of war has gone way too high for Russia in this case, and Russia perhaps had not anticipated this before?
I think it's definitely true that the U.S. Is a driving force in backing Ukraine and pressuring Russia within this conflict. And there's significant reasons behind that. First of all, the U.S. is less dependent on Russia economically and in the energy sector, which is why it's more aggressive in being able to counter Russia than, say, European countries like Germany or France. However, I would say that the U.S. does still feel an impact on the home front from this conflict, including the rising price of gasoline and also the general inflation that's really putting a lot of political pressure on the Biden administration. So while it is in the U.S. interest to weaken Russia, and I think that's a big part of the U.S. decision making in backing Ukraine, it's also in the U.S. interest to stop this war from intensifying or going on for a prolonged period, especially if it would to spill over into NATO territory.
But the cost is also going higher for Russia, and now Russia is considering China to be another partner. China, on one hand, is the largest buyer of the global energy, and Russia is perhaps an isolated supplier now that cannot sell it or might not like to sell it on Europe any further. Don't you see opportunities of synergy growing further between the two nations?
I would say that China's position is definitely concerning to the U.S., which is why we've seen the U.S. Basically reach out to Beijing to discuss China's economic and security support for Russia. So earlier this week, we saw the National Security Chief, Jake Sullivan, meeting with the Chinese foreign minister on Monday and holding a very long discussion. And Biden is now set to hold a call with Xi this week as well. So really the U.S. interest here is to make sure that the Chinese support, it's not to cut off Chinese support for Russia completely, which I think is unrealistic, but it's to limit that support in the military and especially in the economic realm so that Russia doesn't have a safeguard, essentially a safety valve for U.S. sanctions pressure. So the Chinese element here is really, really important to watch in the negotiations and in the conflict in general moving forward.
Thank you very much, Eugene Chausovsky, for again being a guest in my program.
Thank you very much for having me.
Coming back to you, Samad, we had a detailed conversation with Eugene, and he believes that the synergy between China and Russia is likely to grow, but it is actually the United States that is deciding the fate of Russia and European Union in this war. What are your comments on it?
Bearing in mind the recent meeting, the online meeting between the American President Biden and the Chinese President Xi, we saw that China is prepared to take on a new role in the international arena. And by no means it's going to sort of try and subdue the US and the pressures that it has been trying to sort of put on China so as to somehow condemn the war in Europe, the Russian-Ukraine war. On the other hand, the US obviously sitting thousands of miles away, it has its own concerns in Europe, but ultimately it's Europe that's suffering, and the conflict will need to be de-escalated by the local powers, by the countries such as Germany, France, and efforts will have to be made from the Russian side as well, bearing in mind and keeping obviously the Ukrainian Mr. Zelensky in the loop as well.
And a major development that has happened as a, well, I believe as a consequence of this escalation is Saudi Arabia and China coming closer and saying we are going to trade our oil in petro yuan. Now that reminds me of petrodollars of 70s that actually became a buzzword and then served as a major reason for dollar to be a global currency for trade. How significant of a development is this?
This will naturally take a while for it to materialize. When we bear in mind the agreement signed between the Saudis and the Americans in Richard Nixon's era, the petrodollar, the term that came around to be, obviously this new development is a cause for concern for US as well. But we have to bear in mind that currently about 80% of oil is purchased and sold in dollars, and countries only have about, basically yuan only plays about 2.74%, or rather 2.448% of the exchange reserves in the international, international countries' reserves. So bearing that in mind, how that is going to actually materialize, Saudi Arabia is sort of antagonized right now against the US's closeness towards Iran as well. So a lot of things have to be taken into mind. They have to be taken into consideration before actually thinking that this is something that may have some international implications. But the countries have signed and they have shown inclination towards it. Let's see how it unfolds in the coming days.
Sarmad, that brings another important thing to the table. And you just mentioned that there are very few countries that have actually their foreign reserves in yuan. Let me just give you three numbers. So $650 billion of Russia have been frozen by the United States just recently, just last week. 20 billion of Afghan money is also being contested by the Afghans. $300 billion of Libya were frozen for God knows better reason, and Libya is still fractured in two states, and they're fighting with each other. Collectively, it makes close to $1 trillion that has been frozen by the United States and allies unilaterally. Don't you think this will become a point of concern for all other nations that might have problems with the United States or might have diplomatic disagreements with the United States going forward? And if so, will it not further augment the concept of taking yuan as an alternate?
Absolutely, absolutely. I think a lot of countries at this point are thinking, for instance, we have seen recently that Russia and India are going to trade in India in Indian rupees and rubles. So that is one development that we have to appreciate. We saw back in 2014 that Russia and China had actually agreed on conducting trade in rubles and yuan as well. Then we have alternative currencies, the digital currencies coming up as well. And with the blockchain technology coming up, naturally countries have realized that they just cannot have their economies and their trade etched completely linked to dollar as the forerunner, as the major currency that can actually either develop or destroy the economies. All these countries have their concerns, and in the coming days, it is likely that states will have to look towards other currencies, perhaps trade in their own currencies. Euro, for instance, it has some significant role as well. As I've mentioned before as well, currently it's difficult for countries to move from dollar to any other currency. But at some point, with this realization coming in, we'll see some sort of change.
And as you also specialize in the military history, and we were talking about the military history's role as well before the program. So the way Russia is proceeding in Ukraine and the way this war is stretching now, it's in its fourth week. How do you believe this will reverse from here, or how will this end? Do you anticipate that Russia will hold on to Ukraine, or it might just go back, since it has already accomplished what it initially started the war for, and that is that Ukraine doesn't look towards NATO as its concrete umbrella to shelter against odds?
I think that's a very valid point. Bearing in mind how countries behave once their objectives are achieved. I think an important point, and I've mentioned before as well, we talked about the no-fly zone, and we see that Russia is playing a safe game, and it has calculated what exactly it's going to sort of gain. It has war gamed the whole scenario. And I'll explain what a no-fly zone means as well. So when a country or a space or a territory is declared as a no-fly zone, what it means is that the enemy states can no longer, they can actually no longer preemptively strike the country's jets. They can no longer continue towards working, in a reactive fashion, and they cannot conduct any sort of surveillance without actually getting into the war. So these countries have not done that, and they are not ready to declare Ukraine as a no-fly zone. Bearing that in mind, obviously dialogue is the way to go. Russia knows that, Ukraine knows that as well, and with Europe and the US, along with the NATO forces, they all understand that this is something that they cannot move towards. Russia is a nuclear weapon state. Countries in Europe, Britain and France, they have nuclear weapons, and NATO has nuclear weapons as well. This can no longer be taken as something that would actually evolve into a full-fledged war in Europe. These countries will have to somewhat, as they have restrained themselves. They don't want to escalate. They don't want to continue with this war, and with the financial losses being borne by both sides, ultimately they'll have to pull back. And dialogue, as we've seen with the 15-point agenda, naturally these countries are willing to talk to each other despite bombing and shelling going on. They're working towards dialogue.
Another 100 billion euros have been added to Germany's defense budget. How true are the fears of the European countries to foresee an invasion or to foresee a war getting into their doorsteps? Do you think actually there will ever be a chance of a country coming into, and if not, then is this hysteria being created by the military-industrial complex? Because a country like Germany, quite a strong economy, is spending more money on defense at the times when its economy is in trouble.
I think we have to understand that the $100 billion that will be spent on defense will not be just in one year. This will be phased out over the years so as to equip the German defense forces with the right sort of weapons, with the right sort of material, so as to better their defensive capabilities. Bearing in mind that as well, obviously the situation in Europe is, we don't see that Germany is going to come up as a major military power, being able to sort of challenge Russia's role in Europe. And I don't think Germany has any inclinations or any plans on doing so. The dollars or the euros that will be spent on the defense will have to be in the defensive realm more than offensive realm. And we have seen their restraint. NATO has all the tools and the equipment at the helm so as to respond to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. However, they haven't done so. This is because they cannot afford a war in Europe. And with a country like Germany, with a top-class economy in the world, it doesn't want war in Europe.
Thank you very much, Ahmad Zia, for being guest in my program.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, both of my guests are of the view that this war has consequences and costs for both the sides. Not only Russia is paying, but also Europe is facing some acute financial crisis. And these financial crises are going to be a very decisive factor in deciding the course of this war. We'll take a break and we'll join you with the second segment of the program. Stay with us. Welcome back. Organization of Islamic Countries is the second largest international organization in the world after United Nations. And this organization was made with a mandate of playing a leading role to bring together the concerns of Muslim Ummah under one platform. Ever since its establishment, the organization has done a lot of work for Ummah. But broadly, there was a revitalization in this organization's role ever since Prime Minister Imran Khan spoke on the forum of United Nations General Assembly about the issue of Islamophobia. Not only many countries applauded his stance on the issue of Islamophobia, but also OIC countries decided to meet together more often. And this time they are meeting. Their Council of Foreign Ministers is meeting, that is a body of OIC, again in Islamabad on 22nd and 23rd of March. To discuss more about OIC's conference, I am joined by Ms. Arhama Siddiqui. She's a famous defense analyst based in Islamabad. Arhama, welcome to the program.
having me.
So, what do you think is the significance of this OIC conference now taking place in Islamabad once again?
So, as you mentioned in your intro as well, Pakistan has been very active on the OIC front. Also, we had last December, we had hosted the emergency meeting on Afghanistan, the extraordinary meeting of the OIC CFM on Afghanistan in Pakistan, which was deemed a success, which is a success because it helped shed light on the humanitarian situation in Pakistan. The importance of this follow-up meeting, not follow-up, it was already in the works, but a sort of follow-up to the Afghanistan meeting as well, is that the situation in Afghanistan, the proposed framework for humanitarian aid to Afghanistan, is one of the 6 items in the agenda to be discussed at the OIC. And also, given that the UN passed the 15th March, it celebrated that as Combating Islamophobia Day, which is very significant because Pakistan, as you mentioned, had been spearheading it since 2018 especially. The OIC had given it this status for the past 2 years, but now that the UN had recognized it, that showed the culmination of success of the OIC and of Pakistan as well. So again, this meeting will reinforce again that persistence in the right direction always pays off, especially if you look at Pakistan's efforts. It should not only be an individual country's efforts, it should be the collective Muslim Ummah, 57 countries. So that will be the main significance, that they can achieve anything they want only if they persist in the right direction. There are 6 agendas, 6 items on the agenda: Palestine, Kashmir, Islamophobia, corruption, COVID-19, economic recovery, and of course humanitarian situation in Afghanistan. And the leader from Kashmir has also been invited, though I don't think he'll be able to take part because he's in the detained Kashmir. But they're significant.
Since you have also discussed the major 6 items that are going to be discussed in this OIC's meeting, what do you think would be the significance of discussing all of these points that have been shied to discuss or that have not been taken up rightly by an Arab nation? As you just mentioned, the issue of Palestine, where more than 70 times the resolutions that were passed by the general body have been vetoed by the veto powers. So don't you think this platform will just serve the purpose of once again bringing some more pressure on the United Nations to talk about the issue of Palestine?
So the thing about the OIC is that what people should be cognizant of is the OIC is a political platform. So apart from creating the right amount of pressure, it can't really coerce other countries in the international body to adopt certain resolutions. But because, as I mentioned, Islamophobia, OIC had been keenly pursuing the Islamophobia, Combating Islamophobia Act for a long time, and hopefully maybe in the coming years it will be passed on as a resolution as well. But the OIC can once again shed light on Palestine, Kashmir. The situation in Palestine is increasingly becoming graver not by the hour, by the second. There have been multiple killings in the last hour alone. And so the OIC can once again shed light on the Palestine issue. OIC was formed because of the Palestine issue. So it can give another boost up voice to this issue. But in terms of actually accomplishing or coercing or making other countries
Thank you very much.
understand.
Thank you very much, Arhama Siddiqui, for being guest in my program. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm now joined by Syed Muhammad Ali, Director of CAS and a frequent guest in my program. Ali, I welcome you again to my program.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Ali, since 2009, our neighbor has done a great amount of efforts to diplomatically isolate Pakistan. And there were a series of things done to isolate Pakistan or to create an image that Pakistan is isolated. Now, for the second time in last few months, OIC conference is again taking place in Islamabad. I'm told that more than 48 countries have already confirmed their representation. How big of a development is this?
Thank you very much. I think it's a very important development. Let me explain its significance in some context. Number one, UN resolution I'm familiar with regarding Islamophobia, which was proposed and sponsored by Pakistan. I think that's where this Pakistan's diplomatic initiative actually started. Because, when Pakistan sponsored resolution was unanimously accepted and adopted at the United Nations General Assembly, then that is evidence that not only the Muslim world, but the entire world recognizes a pivotal role in upholding and leading the Muslim world on issues, number one. Number two, after the United Nations General Assembly, OIC is the world's largest multilateral diplomacy forum, involving more than 50 countries. So this also, holding this 48th Foreign Minister Conference of OIC is again another evidence that Pakistan enjoys trust and respect of all the Muslim world. Now, the third part, which is the timing of this conference, which is very important because of the major global transformation of the world order. And I think it's a very important and timely opportunity for Muslim world leaders to sit together and consult that what does this global world order transformation mean for them? Should they pursue a policy of alignment, non-alignment, or how they see charting a course for the Muslim Ummah, learning from the bitter lessons of the Cold War and the War on Terror? And lastly, the specific agenda of this is threefold. One is unity, the second is justice, and the third is development. And as the analyst speaking before me, that besides uniting the Muslim world, it will be a useful effort to raise and consult on issues of common concern, including Islamophobia, including Kashmir, including Palestine, and also very importantly Afghanistan. So these things are going to get a lot of attention, and also charting a course and developing a strategy for a common cause of developing the Muslim world and reducing the Western exploitation and coercion.
And Muhammad Ali, not only what you just mentioned, but is this not also an opportunity to just review the developments that these countries had decided in the last meeting with regards to Afghanistan? Because we have not seen any major progress happening on front of Afghanistan as well. Its financial system is still cut off from the rest of the world. And the worries are increasing for the people living in Afghanistan. So don't you think it is also a very timely opportunity for these countries to sit together and to see what further role they can play with regards to Afghanistan?
Absolutely, because Afghanistan means completely different as was viewed during the Cold War and then during the War on Terror. Now, the future of Afghanistan is important for this region, but also for the Muslim world in terms of very important geostrategic location that it offers, because if the regional countries and the Muslim world in particular contribute towards stabilizing, developing Afghanistan, then the entire Muslim world will, benefit from the fruits of its prosperity and progress in rather than politics, which have cost the entire Muslim world and divided us along ethnic and other geopolitical lines.
Thank you very much, Muhammad Ali, for being guest in my program. Ladies and gentlemen, this was Sayyid Muhammad Ali, and he touched upon some very important points that I would want to recap because there was a bit of lag in his voice while he was talking. And one very important thing that he mentioned was the timing of this conference. This timing is extremely important because there are many other countries in the world that are looking toward the Islamic countries to stand up and galvanize on the opportunity so extended by United Nations by declaring 15th of March a day to identify the cause of Islamophobia. Also, that the promises made by all these countries for Afghanistan, certainly for which they have also done a lot of work, but a review of it is also very significant, and again a time to remind the world of its promises on issues of Palestine and Kashmir. We'll join you next week with another program, and until then, Allah Hafiz.